Two Nazis. One ran the trains to Auschwitz. The other chose who died at the gates. Adolf Eichmann or Josef Mengele. Who was more dangerous? One hid behind paperwork. The other hid behind a scalpel. You think you know evil? Think again. Two Nazis. One ran the trains to Auschwitz. The other chose who died at the gates. Adolf Eichmann or Josef Mengele. Who was more dangerous? One hid behind paperwork. The other hid behind a scalpel. You think you know evil? Think again. In the vast machinery of Nazi Germany, two men stood out not for their ranks, but for the cold efficiency with which they committed crimes against humanity. Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele. Both German, both symbols of horror, yet each represented a different face of evil. Adolf Eichmann was not a frontline killer. He never operated gas chambers, never held a gun to a victim's head. Instead, he was the bureaucrat of death. From his desk in the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA, Section 4, B4, he orchestrated the deportation of over 6 million Jews to ghettos, labor camps, and extermination centers. He mastered logistics, timetables, train schedules, paperwork. The Holocaust was not just a crime of ideology, it was a crime of administration. Eichmann made sure the trains ran on time, straight to the camps. Josef Mengele, by contrast, was the face victims saw before death. Known as the Angel of Death at Auschwitz, he selected who would live and who would die upon arrival. A physician with a PhD in anthropology and medicine, Mengele led grotesque human experiments, particularly on twins and children. He injected dyes into eyes, amputated limbs without anesthesia, and exposed prisoners to extreme temperatures, all under the guise of research. His victims often numbered in the thousands. Many never made it off his operating table alive. Eichmann represented the machinery, Mengele, the madness. They were not mere cogs following orders. Eichmann, while hiding behind the defense of obedience, showed initiative and zeal. He traveled to multiple countries, Hungary, Slovakia, the Netherlands, to ensure deportations were efficient. Mengele, on the other hand, wasn't under direct orders to experiment on children. He chose to. He relished the control. He operated outside scientific norms, ethical boundaries, and even the internal Nazi medical code. Historians and war crimes experts today view both men as essential to understanding the Holocaust. Eichmann revealed how genocide can be planned on paper. Mengele showed how cruelty can wear a lab coat. In this comparison, we will examine how they operated, what motivated them, how dangerous they were, and why the world must remember both. Their crimes weren't the same, but they led to the same place: mass death. Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele committed crimes that differed not just in method, but in mindset. One organized death from a distance, the other inflicted it up close, but neither showed remorse. Eichmann's approach was systematic. He wasn't the architect of the final solution, that was Reinhard Heydrich, but he was its logistical mastermind. Between 1941 and 1945, Eichmann coordinated the deportation of millions of Jews from across Nazi-occupied Europe to extermination camps such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. He used train timetables, legal decrees, and bureaucratic pressure. He traveled extensively, negotiating with local collaborators to speed up deportations. In Hungary alone, between May and July 1944, Eichmann oversaw the deportation of approximately 437,000 Jews in just 8 weeks. He saw this not as murder, but as a successful operation. In his own words during his 1961 trial in Jerusalem, "I was only responsible for transportation." That excuse didn't hold. His psychological profile painted a more complex picture. Eichmann was not a mindless drone. He took pride in his efficiency. He competed with other SS officers to process more deportations. He believed in Nazi ideology, but more importantly, he believed in structure, obedience, and climbing the ranks. Mengele's crimes, by contrast, were hands-on and deeply personal. At Auschwitz, he had absolute power over life and death on the selection ramp. With a flick of his wrist, he would separate the strong from the weak, the useful from the doomed. But it was in his laboratory where his full cruelty emerged. He experimented on over 1,500 sets of twins, many of them children. He performed surgeries without anesthesia, injected chemicals into their eyes, and conducted blood transfusion tests between siblings. After killing one twin, he often dissected the body to compare it with the surviving sibling. His motives were a mix of pseudoscience, racial obsession, and personal fascination. He was searching for biological proof of Aryan superiority, and he was willing to torture thousands to find it. Unlike Eichmann, Mengele operated largely outside the strict chain of command. He had scientific freedom within Auschwitz, a playground for his inhuman research. He rarely documented his procedures in detail, making accountability difficult after the war. Survivors described him as polite, almost charming, until the moment he ordered their deaths. That contrast made him even more terrifying. Psychologically, Mengele fits the profile of a clinical sadist with delusions of scientific grandeur. Eichmann, by contrast, fits the mold of what political theorist Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. A man who did evil not with malice, but with paperwork and planning. One killed by planning train routes, the other by cutting flesh. One never touched his victims, the other touched too many. When comparing Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele, one question stands out. Who posed the greater threat, not just in terms of body count, but in influence, scope, and moral collapse? In raw numbers, Eichmann's impact was far greater. As the SS officer in charge of Jewish affairs and deportations, he was directly responsible for the transportation of millions. His work led to the industrial-scale murder of roughly 6 million Jews, as well as tens of thousands of Romani people, political prisoners, and others. His role was systemic. He wasn't killing with his own hands, but without him, the machinery wouldn't have run as smoothly. Eichmann didn't invent the Holocaust, but he made it operational. He standardized deportations, optimized train routes, and pushed for faster removal of Jews from countries like Hungary, Slovakia, and the Netherlands. Even Heinrich Himmler, his superior, at times attempted to slow deportations toward the end of the war. Eichmann resisted, insisting the solution must be completed. That zeal shows how far he went beyond obedience. Josef Mengele's reach was smaller in scale, but deeply symbolic. He didn't kill millions, but the nature of his crimes etched him into history. At Auschwitz, it's estimated he directly oversaw the death or maiming of up to 3,000 people, many of them children. While Eichmann's victims died en masse and anonymously, Mengele's suffered personally, brutally, and under the mask of science. Experts in genocide studies classify Eichmann as a structural perpetrator, the kind that makes mass killing sustainable over time. Mengele is categorized as a performative perpetrator, someone who kills to exert control, to express ideology, or for personal satisfaction. Dr. Deborah Lipstadt, a prominent Holocaust historian, once noted, Eichmann's evil was in how ordinary he looked doing the most horrific things. Mengele's evil was in how much he wanted to do them. Eichmann showed how the state could normalize genocide. Mengele reminded us how individuals could take pleasure in it. From a legal standpoint, Eichmann was captured by Israeli intelligence in Argentina in 1960, tried publicly, and executed in 1962. His trial marked the first time many around the world heard Holocaust survivors speak. It was a defining moment in post-war justice. Mengele, on the other hand, escaped. He died in Brazil in 1979, never facing trial. This unresolved ending gave his myth a darker edge. He remained a ghost, a symbol of justice denied. So who was more dangerous? In scale, Eichmann. In cruelty, Mengele. In legacy, both. One revealed the terror of cold systems. The other showed how science, unchained from ethics, could become a weapon. Together, they embodied the full range of Nazi evil. The stories of Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele didn't end with the fall of the Third Reich. Their crimes, trials, or lack thereof, and the scars they left behind continue to shape how the world understands evil, justice, and the fragile line between obedience and conscience. Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem in 1961 was a turning point. For the first time, the horror of the Holocaust was laid out in public through survivor testimony. Eichmann sat in a glass box, calm, polite, bureaucratic. He claimed he never hated Jews, never killed anyone, and only followed orders. The court rejected this defense. He was found guilty on 15 counts, including crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. He was executed by hanging in 1962. The trial popularized Hannah Arendt's phrase, "the banality of evil." She argued that Eichmann was not a monster, but terrifyingly normal, a man who never questioned the morality of his actions because he was more concerned with job performance than human life. That idea still fuels debates about personal responsibility within authoritarian systems. Mengele, in contrast, became a symbol of unpunished cruelty. After the war, he fled to South America with help from Nazi sympathizers and the Vatican's rat lines. Despite being one of the most wanted war criminals, he avoided capture for over 30 years. He drowned in Brazil in 1979, living under a false name. His remains were identified in 1985. Mengele's evasion of justice became a case study in the failures of post-war accountability. His name now stands alongside others, like Amon Goeth and Irma Grese, figures whose brutality marked the darkest extremes of individual behavior during the Holocaust. Today, Eichmann and Mengele are more than just historical villains. They are case studies. Eichmann represents what happens when people stop thinking ethically and hide behind the system. Mengele shows what can happen when power, ideology, and sadism combine under the guise of science. Their crimes didn't just belong to the past, they challenge every generation. They ask, what would you do in their place? Would you follow orders? Would you speak out? Would you even notice? History remembers them differently, but both serve as warnings. Eichmann taught us that mass murder can come from a desk. Mengele taught us it can come in a white coat. And remembering both is how we ensure it never happens again. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Eichmann and Mengele showed us two sides of the same nightmare: systemized death and scientific cruelty. One was executed, the other escaped justice, but their legacy? It's still haunting us. So, here's the question: which is more terrifying? Evil born from obedience or evil born from desire? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk. If this story made you think, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because we've got more stories that history tried to bury.